Hola, what's the weather like where you are today? Sunny, rainy, cloudy? Comment below.
When I asked my parents for help with rent, they laughed. Not in a nervous, uncomfortable way like they weren't sure how to say no, but in that smug, judgmental, almost delighted kind of laugh that told me they'd been waiting for this moment just so they could rub in the fact that they were right and I was wrong. It stung more than I expected it to, because I wasn't calling from a vacation in Tulum or lounging around waiting for some miracle to drop in my lap. I was working, nonstop, every damn day. I was creating branding kits for tech startups I could barely pronounce, designing influencer merch that made me cringe, drawing children's book illustrations for authors who were always still finalizing the manuscript, and yet somehow wanted 5 pages by Monday. I wasn't asking for a handout. I was asking for a lifeline, a buffer, just enough to cover the overdue rent and avoid a late fee, but all I got was laughter. My mom, Deborah, with her stiff, I raised you better voice, said something like, "Well, honey, you chose that path." And my dad, Frank, chimed in right on cue with, "You should have gone into something practical like Ryan did." Then she added the cherry on top. "We can't enable your bad decisions." That word, enable, it hit me like a slap. Like I was some addict begging for another hit, not their daughter who had been scraping by in one of the most expensive cities in the country, doing everything short of selling blood to stay afloat. I didn't cry, I didn't even get angry. I just went quiet, thanked them anyway, and hung up. 7 days later, a Facebook post nearly knocked the wind out of me. It was a carousel of pictures. My brother Ryan smiling next to his freshly signed deed, my mom holding up a bottle of champagne, my dad with a stupid, proud grin, standing in front of a gleaming high-rise in downtown Manhattan. The caption read, "Proud parent moment. Ryan's hard work and smart choices finally paid off. New condo, new chapter. Hard work always wins." I stared at it for way too long, my thumb hovering over the like button out of pure habit before I caught myself. My parents had laughed when I asked for help with a late rent check, and now they were throwing a mini photo shoot for my brother, the golden boy, for buying a place in Manhattan, with money he made sitting behind a desk, moving other people's money around. Let me be clear, I don't hate my brother. I never did. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't tired of being the invisible one. From the time we were kids, Ryan could sneeze and someone would hand him a tissue and a trophy. I'd get straight A's and my mom would ask why I didn't join more clubs. Ryan joined one club, Debate, and they framed every damn ribbon. When I got my first freelance contract after college, working with a small publishing house, I was over the moon. I sent my mom screenshots of the mock-ups. She responded with a thumbs-up emoji. Meanwhile, when Ryan got promoted at his firm, some job I still don't fully understand, even now, she sent out a mass text with photos and ended it with, "Proud of our achiever." That was her word for him. Achiever. Mine was creative, and not in a good way. In the starving artist pipe dream, one day you'll grow out of it kind of way. That condo post, it wasn't about the condo, it was about what they didn't post. They never once acknowledged the years I worked every job under the sun, the nights I stayed up finishing illustrations for clients in Australia, the times I chose not to come home for holidays because I couldn't afford the flight and the week off unpaid. They never posted the book that used my artwork and sold out its first print run, or the design that went viral in a niche art community I loved, or the time my client offered to fly me to Berlin for a launch event. Because to them, none of that was real. If it didn't come with a corporate badge or a mortgage, it didn't count. That night, I sat on my mattress, because I didn't even have a proper bed frame yet, and stared at my ceiling, just stewing in that weird mix of bitterness and exhaustion. I wasn't mad that Ryan got the condo. I was mad that they treated my life like it was a series of failed experiments, while his was some grand narrative of success. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to blow up at them or write a dramatic Facebook comment or send a passive-aggressive email pointing out everything I'd accomplished without them noticing. I wanted something else, something quieter, something deeper. The next day, I was catching up with Jessie, my best friend since art school, and one of the few people who never made me feel like I had to explain why I wanted to draw for a living. We were sitting in her tiny, sunlit apartment in Crown Heights, drinking the cheapest boxed wine known to man, and I showed her the post. She scrolled through it, scoffed, and then looked at me with that look she gets when she's about to drop truth bombs. "You know what your problem is?" she said. "You want them to see you, but they never will. Not unless you slap them across the face with it." I laughed, but it hurt. "What am I supposed to do, put my name up in lights?" Jessie raised her eyebrows. "Why the hell not?" It was meant as a joke, just a joke, but something shifted in my chest, like a door cracking open in a long sealed hallway. I didn't know how or when or even if it was possible. But suddenly, the idea didn't seem so ridiculous. Maybe I didn't need them to understand me. Maybe I just needed them to see me, one time, loud and clear, in a way they couldn't ignore. I went home that night and opened my laptop, half out of curiosity, half out of defiance. Somewhere in the back of my inbox, buried beneath spam and unpaid invoice reminders, I remembered getting an email months ago, some vague opportunity for independent artists. I searched for it, barely remembering the subject line. I didn't even think it was real at the time. But there it was. Subject: Times Square Feature Opportunity, NYC Creatives Campaign. And just like that, something in me snapped into place. The thing about favoritism in a family is that it never announces itself outright. It creeps in slowly, in the smallest comments, in the way dinner conversations get directed, in the tone used when discussing life plans, and in the kind of gifts you unwrap on Christmas morning, not because you asked for them, but because someone assumed something about you they never cared to confirm. I grew up in a house where love wasn't scarce exactly, but it was selective, conditional, doled out based on things you could measure on a report card or hang on a wall. And even though I never had the words for it back then, I always knew, with a kind of quiet certainty only kids seem to grasp instinctively, that my parents didn't see me the way they saw Ryan, that to them, I was an idea they couldn't quite figure out how to support because it didn't come with a timeline or a salary band or a retirement plan. I remember one afternoon, I must have been around 12, when I brought home a drawing I'd been working on for days. It was a full, hand-colored map of a fantasy world I'd made up, with tiny kingdoms, little scrolls of scripted names, and mountains shaded with the side of a No. 2 pencil I had whittled down to a stub. I was so proud of it, I could hardly wait to show it to my mom. I waited for her to finish grading papers. She used to teach 5th grade at the local school, and laid the paper gently on the kitchen table like it was some artifact from a museum. She looked up, squinted, and said, "That's nice, honey, but you left your laundry in the dryer again." And by the time she walked out of the room, she had left my drawing half covered by a pile of coupons and grocery lists. Later that week, Ryan won 2nd place in his middle school science fair for a volcano project that their neighbor's kid basically did for him. My parents cleared out an entire shelf in the basement to start what they called the achievement display, and the first thing to go up was his little red ribbon in a glass frame. My drawing got bent and forgotten somewhere behind the fridge magnet that held the electric bill. That shelf grew over the years: baseball trophies, a community college certificate, some minor award from work. Meanwhile, my shelf, if you could call it that, stayed empty, unless you count the one report card I brought home in sophomore year that had a single C on it, which became a household scandal for a week. The strange part is, for a long time, I tried to explain it away. I told myself maybe it wasn't favoritism, maybe they just didn't understand art. Maybe they thought being hard on me would push me harder. Maybe it was just easier to celebrate things they recognized: titles, promotions, purchases, things you could talk about at barbecues without having to explain what it meant to build a portfolio, or why freelance contracts were often unpaid until after delivery. But the truth is, none of those excuses really made it sting less. They just gave me a way to pretend I didn't care, when in fact I cared more than I ever admitted out loud. After college, when I moved to New York, I didn't ask for their blessing. I packed up my car with what little I had, waved goodbye, and drove away with the unspoken understanding that if I failed, I'd be proving them right. And if I succeeded, they'd call it luck. I lived with 3 roommates in a crumbling walk-up with peeling paint, used mismatched forks, and slept on a mattress on the floor for 2 years straight. And during all that time, I didn't once ask them for help, until last week. And that was my mistake. I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd see I was trying, see how far I'd come, and meet me halfway. But all I got was the same laugh I'd heard when I told them I wanted to be an artist at age 9. So when Jesse said, slap them across the face with it, I wasn't thinking about vengeance. Not really. I was thinking about that feeling I had when I saw my name on my first client's website, tiny as it was, tucked in the corner in a barely readable font, but still mine. I wanted to feel that again. Bigger, louder, impossible to ignore. Which is why, after finding that email in my inbox, half buried, half forgotten, I didn't just close it and go back to sketching Instagram icons for a fashion influencer who still owed me $200. I clicked the link. The message was from a creative agency in Brooklyn I'd submitted work to last year. They were partnering with a nonprofit initiative aiming to feature underrepresented artists in Times Square as part of an urban revival campaign. The submission was supposed to include a short portfolio, a 1-minute video introduction, and a personal statement about what my work meant to me. I had sent it in on a whim, in the middle of a long night when my back hurt and my fingers were cramped, and I didn't think I'd ever hear back. But there it was, the confirmation. I'd been selected. They wanted to feature one of my pieces, plus a bio slide, for a full 24 hours on the biggest digital billboard above 47th Street. There was just one catch. They needed a licensing fee. A small one, compared to what that kind of exposure would normally cost, but still way out of my comfort zone, especially now, when my rent was still unpaid, and my fridge held nothing but condiments and off-brand sparkling water. I sat at my desk, staring at that screen for what must have been an hour, weighing my options, debating whether it was stupid to even consider it. But the idea of walking into Times Square and seeing my name up there, not just on a little line at the bottom of someone else's campaign, but front and center, with my art, my message, my story, it was too much to ignore. I started pacing, calling Jessie, half hysterical, half laughing, asking if it made sense to pour my last remaining dollars into a billboard just to prove a point. She didn't even hesitate. You've been waiting your whole life for someone to validate your work. Why not be the one to do it? Hell, if I had a Times Square moment, I'd spend my rent on that too. So I did something I'm not proud of. I overdrew my account. I paid the licensing fee using the last $50 I had and a credit card I promised myself I wouldn't touch unless it was an emergency. And it felt like one. Not a financial one, but an emotional one. A full-blown, soul-on-fire moment where I realized that if I didn't take this shot, I might regret it for the rest of my life. The confirmation came through just before midnight. They scheduled the feature for the following Friday. And as I sat there, broke, exhausted, and slightly terrified of what I'd just done, a single thought anchored me in place. This wasn't just about proving my parents wrong. This was about proving me right. There's a particular kind of silence that fills a room when you've just spent the last of your money on something completely intangible, something that, to most people, would seem impulsive, impractical, even irresponsible, but you know, with some deep, irrational certainty, that it might be the one thing that makes all the struggle finally mean something. That's the silence I sat in the night I hit confirm payment on the licensing agreement for the Times Square feature. A silence so dense it felt like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting to see whether I'd just made the dumbest decision of my life or the boldest. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent weeks agonizing over whether to ask my parents for help with rent, something concrete and necessary, something that would have kept me housed and afloat. But I hesitated because I knew the answer would be laced with judgment and disappointment. Yet here I was, emptying out my account for a few seconds of digital glory, for a billboard slot that didn't guarantee a client, a contract, or a dollar, just a moment, just a name, my name, up there in lights, for a crowd of strangers who wouldn't even know what they were looking at. It didn't feel smart. It felt necessary. The fee itself wasn't outrageous, at least not by New York standards. But when you're living off freelance invoices that arrive weeks late or never at all, and you're already juggling late rent, a Metro card that keeps flashing insufficient balance, and a fridge stocked with nothing but almond milk and expired hummus, any unexpected expense feels like it might collapse the entire house of cards. I had exactly $23.47 in my checking account when I saw the email, and after splitting the licensing fee across two near maxed out credit cards and the remainder of my balance, I was left with $2 and a few cents, barely enough for a bus ride, let alone a fallback plan. I didn't tell Jessie, not right away. She would have been supportive, no doubt, probably would have thrown in her own rent money if she thought it would help. But something about this felt too fragile to share. Like saying it out loud before it happened might curse it, might jinx the entire thing, or worse, turn it into a joke before it had a chance to become real. So instead, I kept it to myself, clutching the confirmation email like a lottery ticket, oscillating between bursts of adrenaline and waves of paralyzing doubt. The week that followed was a blur of half-slept nights and over-caffeinated mornings, a constant mental tug-of-war between feeling like I was finally stepping into something bigger than myself and fearing I had just thrown money into a pit of nothing. I still had client work to do, logos to finalize, edits to send back, invoices to chase, but all of it felt like background noise compared to what was coming. I began obsessing over the artwork I had submitted, second-guessing every color, every shape, wondering if I should have gone with a different piece, one that looked more commercial or safe. But the one I sent was personal, deeply, almost embarrassingly so. It was a piece I'd drawn in the middle of a panic attack months earlier, when everything felt like it was slipping out of my control. Bills piling up, projects drying out, my parents not calling for weeks at a time. I had stayed up that night, hunched over my tablet, drawing without a plan, letting the lines flow until something emerged that felt like a mirror to how I felt. Fractured but whole, vulnerable but defiant, lost but still there. When the agency asked for submissions, it was the only one that felt honest enough to send. I titled it Unseen Work Still Counts. I hadn't told a soul what that title meant. Not my friends, not my therapist, not even Jessie, but it came from the years I spent working in silence, making art in the shadows, hustling through projects that got praise but never credited, living in the margins while people like my brother Ryan got front-page spreads for buying condos with company bonuses and zero student debt. My work didn't come with headlines or champagne. It came with anxiety and midnight breakdowns and a stubborn refusal to give up, even when no one was clapping. By Wednesday, the agency sent me the final layout of the display. My artwork dead center, my name in large clear letters at the bottom, and the title flashing across the screen in white bold font. I stared at the preview for a long time, afraid to blink in case it disappeared. It didn't feel like validation, not yet. It felt like a dare, like the universe was asking me, "You sure you're ready for this?" I still hadn't told my parents. I thought about it more than once, drafting texts I never sent, hovering over the call button, wondering if I should just drop a casual, "Hey, remember when you said I should have chosen a practical career? Well, turns out, Times Square thinks I'm worth noticing." But I didn't, because it wasn't about them anymore. At least, that's what I told myself in the moments when I wasn't consumed with the memory of their laughter, their smug faces, and that damned caption about hard work paying off. Thursday night, the anxiety finally broke through. I found myself pacing my apartment, eyes darting to the clock every few minutes, heartbeat pounding like a bass drum in my chest. I wasn't nervous about the display itself. I was nervous about what would come after. What if no one noticed? What if it went up and came down and nothing changed? What if the moment I had built up in my head for so long turned out to be nothing but a flash in a crowd that didn't care? But somewhere between 3 and 4 in the morning, as the sky outside turned from black to gray, I came to terms with the truth I'd been avoiding. It wasn't about who saw it. It was about me seeing it. About giving myself a moment I didn't need to explain, defend, or share. A moment that would exist whether anyone applauded or not. And so, when the sun finally rose and Friday began, I didn't tell my friends, didn't post anything online, didn't text my family. I showered, got dressed, made the long, quiet subway ride into Midtown, and stood at the edge of Times Square with a cup of dollar store coffee and my hands in my coat pockets, waiting for my name to show up. No one knew I was there, not yet. And that's exactly how I wanted it. There's a strange feeling that settles in your stomach when you're standing in one of the most chaotic, overstimulating, relentlessly noisy places in the world, surrounded by tourists and street performers and blaring horns and oversized digital ads trying to sell you everything from phone plans to Broadway shows. And yet, despite all of it, all that madness and motion, the only thing you can hear is your own breath and the faint, repetitive thud of your heartbeat echoing in your ears as you stare at a screen that's about to show the most vulnerable part of you to a city that doesn't know your name and never really cared to. I stood there in the cold wind of Times Square, coat collar pulled up, cheap coffee slowly losing its warmth in my gloved hands, my eyes scanning the digital displays above, as if I might have somehow gotten the date wrong, as if this moment I'd bet everything on was just a figment of sleep-deprived hope. The city was doing what it always did, moving forward, fast and loud, and with no regard for who stumbled behind. But I stood still, anchored by the silent prayer that maybe, for once, time would stop just long enough for someone like me to be seen, not as a problem to be solved or a disappointment to be endured, but as something worthy of attention, of pride, of space. And then it happened. No announcement, no drum roll, no spotlight. It just flickered into existence, bold and unmistakable, right there on the south-facing billboard above 47th Street. My illustration, vivid and strange and full of tension, took up the full screen in brilliant color, surrounded by all the brightness and noise of Times Square, and yet it was the only thing I could focus on. At the bottom, clear and sharp and almost surreal, was my name, Emily Collins. And just below that, in larger text, the message I had agonized over for days, the one that came to me in the middle of a night when I thought I had nothing left to say. Unseen work still counts. It was beautiful. Not just the image or the lighting or the positioning, but the fact that it was mine. Not filtered through a client's revisions, not tucked into the footer of someone else's brand, not shrunken down to a profile icon or buried in a forgotten folder. It was mine, completely, unapologetically, and undeniably public. I watched as people turned their heads, some out of curiosity, some just to take a photo of everything and anything, the way tourists do. A few pointed. One guy took a picture. Another asked his friend, "Who's Emily Collins?" And his friend shrugged and said, "No idea. Cool art, though." I laughed, quietly under my breath, but it wasn't bitterness. It was release. It was years of being overlooked, of being treated like the family experiment gone wrong, melting into this single, absurdly satisfying moment where I knew I didn't need to explain myself anymore. I stayed there for almost an hour, just watching it loop, watching strangers interact with something I created, none of them knowing what it meant, none of them realizing the story behind it. And somehow, that made it more powerful. Because it wasn't about them understanding. It was about me finally realizing I didn't need them to. I took a few pictures, not because I wanted to post them, at least not right away, but because I knew there would come a time when I'd forget how this felt, when the doubts would creep back in, when another rejection email or ignored invoice or birthday without a call from my parents would chip away at this moment. I wanted proof that, at least once, I was here. I mattered. On the way home, the train was packed, but I barely noticed. I was still in that strange haze between elation and disbelief, reliving every second of it, trying to etch it into memory like the lines of a sketch I'd drawn so many times it became muscle memory. When I finally made it back to my apartment, the first thing I did, after kicking off my shoes and collapsing on the couch, was check my phone, mostly out of habit, and that's when I saw it. The post. My mother, of course. Same exact format as the Condo photos. She had shared a blurry screenshot of the billboard, one someone else must have sent her because she never would have known to look. And the caption read, "Does anyone know what this is? Our daughter Emily's name is on a billboard in New York. We're a little confused. Has she been working on something big?" Confused. That was the word she chose. Not proud, not amazed, not even curious in a supportive way, just confused, as though my visibility was some sort of accidental glitch in the universe, something to be clarified, possibly corrected. It would have been funny if it wasn't so painfully familiar. I stared at the screen, half laughing, half seething, imagining them sitting at their dinner table, furrowing their brows, wondering if they had missed a text or a newsletter or maybe thought this was some scam. Some AI-generated trick that accidentally used my name. I didn't respond. I didn't comment. I didn't call them to explain what it was or what it meant or how many years of work and rejection and persistence had led to that 30-second loop of my art blinking across one of the most iconic intersections on the planet. Instead, I sent a single text to Jessie, no words, just the picture of the billboard and the timestamp. She called me 2 seconds later, screaming into the phone, and when I didn't respond, she said, "Emily, you did it. You actually did it." Later that night, I saw my dad had shared my mom's post, which in itself was rare enough to make me sit up. He added his own caption to it, short and impersonal. "Congrats, I guess. We didn't know you were doing this." That line, that passive, casual dismissal, as if it were some science project I forgot to mention at dinner, as if my career had been happening in a vacuum they couldn't see, and because they didn't see it, it didn't exist. I stared at the post, thumb hovering over the comment box, and for a long time, I started writing replies in my head. I imagined telling them everything about the rent, the freelance years, the sacrifice, the grind, the loneliness, the victory. I imagined typing out every job I'd worked without benefits, every project that got canceled midway, every time I cried myself to sleep, thinking maybe I had chosen wrong. I even imagined saying, "This is why I stopped calling, because every time I did, I left the conversation smaller than when I entered it." But I didn't write any of it. Not one word. Because this wasn't a conversation anymore. It was a conclusion. Instead, I screenshotted the post, sent it to Jessie, and typed, "I'm going to write them back tomorrow." But I didn't. I had something else in mind. Something better. Something final. Something they couldn't laugh off or misunderstand. Because now the world had seen me. And I was just getting started. There's something unsettling about watching people try to reinterpret your life, only after it becomes something they can't ignore, as if all the silence, all the quiet dismissals, all the years of low-level disappointment they carried toward you somehow vanish the moment your name appears in a space they finally recognize as real, a space that carries enough social weight for them to backpedal, revise, and pretend they were supportive all along, as though your journey was simply invisible to them until the lights got bright enough to reflect off their pride. That's what the days after the billboard felt like, a clumsy parade of retroactive concern wrapped in disbelief, where relatives I hadn't spoken to in years sent Facebook messages asking if I really did that artwork, and acquaintances from high school I hadn't thought about since prom suddenly decided I was inspirational. Not because they remembered me chasing this dream, but because they saw my name sandwiched between a phone ad and a tourism promo above a subway entrance on a 20-second loop. But it wasn't those messages that got to me. It was the text from Ryan. He hadn't posted anything publicly, hadn't commented or liked my mother's confused status, hadn't joined the virtual circle of people trying to make sense of something they clearly didn't see coming. Instead, in typical Ryan fashion, he went the one-on-one route, direct and unfiltered. The message came in the evening, 3 days after the billboard ran, at a moment when I was sitting alone in my apartment, eating dry cereal for dinner and listening to the building's ancient radiator clank like it was protesting my every life decision. His message was short but honest in a way that caught me off guard. "Hey, I saw the Times Square thing. I know we don't talk much, but I'm actually jealous. You always chased what you loved, even when no one clapped. That's gutsy as hell. Respect." For a second, I didn't know how to respond. Not because I was angry at him, but because he had never once, in all the years of being the family favorite, acknowledged that our paths weren't just different, they were treated differently, and that part of what made it so hard wasn't the struggle itself, but how our parents filtered our choices through a lens of legitimacy that only seemed to zoom in on him. So I just sat with it. And then, slowly, I typed back a message that felt truer than anything I could have said during all those years we passed each other like satellites in orbit. Funny, I used to think I was the disappointment. Guess we were both wrong. He didn't reply after that, at least not that night, but somehow it was enough. It was the first time I felt like someone in my family actually saw me. Not just the output, not just the shiny moment in the spotlight, but the years of work, the countless quiet victories and crushing failures that had no audience, no applause, no monetary reward. Ryan, of all people, had looked past the lights and seen the fire it took to even get there. The next morning, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was my mother. Her message, unlike Ryan's, was classic Deborah. Carefully composed, probably rewritten several times, likely dictated out loud before being sent. We didn't know about your project in the city. We wish you would have told us. We're happy for you. Let's talk soon. There was no apology in it, no acknowledgement of the years they spent questioning every choice I made, no mention of the laughter that still echoed in my memory from when I asked them for help. Just a vague attempt at reconnecting now that I had suddenly become someone worth talking to again. For a moment, I considered calling her, if only to hear her voice, to gauge the tone, to see if maybe, just maybe, the billboard had knocked something loose in their perspective. But I didn't. Instead, I stared at the message, reread it 3 times, and did something I never thought I'd do. I let it go unanswered, because the truth was I didn't need that conversation. Not anymore. I had spent too many years trying to extract validation from people who were never built to give it. People whose definitions of success were so rigid and outdated they couldn't recognize value unless it came with a corner office or a deed. But the moment my name lit up in Times Square, something shifted in me. Not because it made me famous or rich or even noticed by the masses, but because it reminded me that the work I'd been doing in the shadows, the labor I poured into every illustration, every client, every sleepless night, had always mattered, whether they clapped or not. And still, in the days that followed, I found myself thinking back, not to the billboard, but to something smaller, something quieter. There's this bookstore on the Lower East Side that I've loved for years. One of those places where the shelves are overstuffed and the floorboards creak and no one bothers you if you linger too long in the same aisle. I went there the week after everything happened, partly out of habit, partly just to be somewhere that didn't ask me to perform or explain. I was browsing the children's section, mostly to see if the publishers I had worked with had stocked the latest editions. And there it was, a hardcover book I'd illustrated nearly a year ago, one I was particularly proud of, but that hadn't exactly gone viral. It was sitting on the end cap, propped up as part of a staff recommendation display, and taped to the shelf beneath it was a little handwritten card that read, "Beautiful illustrations that feel like a hug for your inner child." I stood there for what felt like forever, tracing the familiar lines of my own drawing. The colors I'd agonized over, the shapes I had refined until I thought they might drive me insane. No one else in the store noticed. No one asked for an autograph or snapped a photo or even knew my name. And for once, I didn't mind. In fact, I liked it. Because while Times Square gave me a moment of loud, inescapable recognition, it was this quiet shelf in a corner of the city. That reminded me why I started in the first place. Sometimes, the most meaningful work doesn't need to be broadcast to be real. Sometimes, you don't need to shout to be heard. And sometimes, the best revenge isn't a speech, or a post, or even a confrontation. It's the quiet certainty of knowing that while they were busy cheering for someone else's victories, you were building your own from scratch. One sketch at a time, one page at a time, one choice they never understood, but that saved you anyway.